Good morning, everyone. In 2018, a 19-year-old Florida resident posted on social media that he was going to be a professional school shooter and go on a killing rampage. The same year, in California, a 21-year-old resident posted threats online targeting his former high school, including messages saying, "RIP, no one will be graduating, and I hate you all." A separate post pictured him holding an assault rifle. The man making threats in Florida was Nicholas Cruz. He went on to kill 17 people at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland with guns that he legally purchased and possessed, despite many warning signs indicating that he was a danger to others. Meanwhile, in California, an acquaintance informed law enforcement about the threats, and an extreme risk protection order was issued, separating the man from his guns. You've never heard of this person because violence was averted and he did not go on to commit a mass shooting. Today I'll be sharing with you the research on these laws, known most commonly as red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders, ERPOs for short. ERPOs are civil restraining orders that temporarily prevent the purchase and possession of firearms by people judged to be at particularly high risk of harming themselves or others. They provide a targeted intervention to reduce gun violence that responds to behavioral threats rather than prohibiting people based on broad disqualifying criteria. And in this way, they attempt to balance the right to own firearms with the risk of ownership during acute crises. They fill a critical policy gap that allows people to access firearms when they're a danger to themselves or others, but have not otherwise broken the law. The consequences of this gap are most obvious after public mass shootings like the one in Parkland that leave us wondering why the shooter was able to have access to guns in the first place in light of their obvious dangerousness. Currently, 21 states, the District of Columbia, and now the U.S. Virgin Islands have enacted an ERPO law. Details vary by state, including who can serve as the petitioner, that's the person asking the court to issue the order, how long the orders last, and what standards of evidence are used. ERPOs are among the most popular gun policies in the United States. A recent nationally representative survey of adults conducted by Hopkins found that 76% of Americans support allowing family members to ask the court to temporarily remove guns from relatives who they believe to be at risk of harming themselves or others. ERPOs also have strong support among Republicans and gun owners, two groups that have historically been more skeptical of firearm-related legislation. Much of the research on ERPOs so far has focused on their use and implementation. This work has found that uptake of the law tends to be slow at first. For example, there were fewer than 100 orders issued during the first year that the law was in effect in California, Oregon, Washington, New York, Connecticut, and Indiana. There are a few notable exceptions to this pattern, however. For example, Florida issued about 1,200 orders in its first year. One reason for slow uptake is simply lack of awareness about the law. For example, 4 years after California's law went into effect, a representative survey of Californian adults found that fully 2/3 had never heard of it before. And this lack of awareness extends to those who are responsible for its implementation as well, serving as a major barrier. Despite what's generally a slow start, research has found that the number of orders issued does tend to increase year over year as implementation bugs get worked out and more people learn about the law. Last year, for example, New York issued over 5,000 orders. Another commonality among ERPO states is that a majority of petitioners are law enforcement officers, even in states that allow others, like family members, roommates, or clinicians, to petition. For example, in California, over 95% of petitioners are officers. This really highlights the importance of providing ERPO-specific training to law enforcement who are serving as petitioners, attending court hearings, serving the orders to respondents, those are the people that are the subject of the order, and also recovering and storing firearms. Finally, this body of work highlights the variety of cases in which ERPOs are being used to remove firearms from high-risk situations. Depending on the state, estimates range from about 35 to 70% of cases involving threats of suicide, and 45 to 80% of cases including threats of other directed harm. These other directed threats include threats of mass shooting, which we found to be present in 10% of cases using data from 6 states. ERPOs have also been used to disarm people making threats of politically motivated violence or terrorism. These cases sometimes include collaboration with federal agents who can provide intel to local officers who then petition for the order. Other cases of note include those involving cognitive impairment, including things like dementia and psychosis, and those involving brandishing or recklessly using a firearm. Another critical area of ERPO research has been trying to quantify the law's effectiveness at preventing violence. Before getting into those findings, I think it's important to contextualize them and keep a few things in mind. First, the measured effectiveness of these laws depends on how well they're being implemented, not only in terms of the quantity of orders being issued, but also the quality of their use too. So are they actually being targeted to those at highest risk? Second, effectiveness can be measured at the population level. These studies would be looking at changes in rates of violence before and after the law went into effect, or it can be measured at the individual level. These studies would be looking at violence among ERPO respondents and then comparing that to violence in people who didn't receive an ERPO but are also at high risk. The population level studies are much more common and much easier to do because the data are readily available. But there are serious questions about whether it's reasonable to expect to be able to detect a population level effect, given that this is such a new and rarely used intervention. That brings me to the third point, which is that there are some real challenges with studying the effectiveness of ERPO laws. It's very difficult to identify a comparison group for these individual level effectiveness studies. We want to find people who, like ERPO respondents, are at high and imminent risk of violence and are not already prohibited from owning firearms, didn't receive an ERPO, and also aren't about to receive some other firearm prohibiting intervention. This is actually a really tough group of people to identify and get data on. Another challenge in doing this work is that we're looking at rare outcomes, especially if we're talking about mass shootings. And finally, as I mentioned, ERPOs are new and relatively rarely used interventions. That means that population-level effects are going to be harder to detect because such a small proportion of the population are directly affected by the law. So with that in mind, let's turn to some results. So due to many of the challenges that I just mentioned, there's very little research on the effectiveness of ERPOs at preventing mass shootings. Descriptive research, however, is suggestive that ERPOs may have a preventive role to play here. A study I did with Dr. Wintemute and others examined a sample of ERPOs used for mass shooting threats in California. We did an internet search for each of these respondents to see if they went on to commit a mass shooting and found no such indication in any of the 21 cases that we examined. Research on the effectiveness of ERPOs at preventing homicide and assault is nascent, and findings are somewhat mixed so far. A very small number of studies have looked at changes in rates at the population level before and after ERPO law went into effect and found non-significant reductions in violence, meaning that we can't be sure whether the reduction is due to the law going into effect or just to random variation in the outcome over time. However, preliminary results from a descriptive study I'm currently doing has found dramatic reductions of greater than 90% in the rate of arrest for firearm violence among ERPO respondents while the ERPO is in effect, compared to their rate of arrest in the year prior to the ERPO. The evidence, however, really is strongest for the preventive effects of ERPOs on suicide. Most of the effectiveness research to date has been done in this area. Using data from 4 ERPO states, we found that among respondents, 1 suicide is prevented for every 17 to 23 orders issued. Studies have also found a population-level reduction in suicide rates, with one multi-state study finding that ERPO laws were associated with a 6% reduction in firearm suicides. Taken together, the research supports several recommendations. States that don't have ERPO laws could consider adopting such a law. The evidence to date on their effectiveness suggests that this would likely reduce suicide, which is the most common form of gun violence, and may very well reduce interpersonal violence by respondents as well. States with ERPO laws could take several steps to improve their implementation. This should include dedicating resources like time, money, and personnel to their implementation. This should also include training and education, especially to officers and judges, as well as potentially broader outreach efforts as well. States should consider providing court advocates to walk people through the petitioning process, which can be intimidating and confusing. They should also consider formally connecting ERPO respondents to resources like substance abuse treatment or connection to social services for housing and employment, basically getting at those root causes of the crisis that led to the ERPO in the first place. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of collecting data and making it available to researchers. This step is absolutely critical to monitoring ERPO uptake, describing its use, and quantifying its effectiveness. Finally, while ERPOs are state laws, there is an important role for the federal government to play. First, it can support states' adoption and implementation of ERPO laws, as it did with the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And second, the federal government has an important role in supporting ERPO research through grants from relevant agencies like CDC and NIJ. We all share a common goal of finding solutions that prevent firearm violence, and the only way to know what works and what doesn't is through rigorous scientific investigation. Thanks so much for your time.